Right, here in chapter 28, we're going to be looking more at the digestive system and how food moves through the body. So first of all, just looking at the reason we need to eat is mainly for two things. One, to give us energy so we can do work, and so that we can continue to grow. So again, it's our source of energy and the essential building blocks for growth. The optimal diet, and I know there are a lot of different diets that are out there, like keto diets and all kind of different things, but optimal diets have more carbs than fats in them and still a significant amount of protein. So we see kind of the standard right now, so choose my plate. So again, large amounts of grains and carbs, large amounts of vegetables to give us especially fiber and nutrients, significant amounts of protein or fruits in our dairy. And of course, what you don't see on here are fats, because if we're eating all of that, we get natural amounts of fat. So looking at our carbs and fats, these are our two main energy sources. So our carbohydrates are different grains and cereals or breads. We see we get about 4.1 calories per gram. So again, our body uses that for energy. Then our dietary fats, and again, we get these from various sources, but oils, margarines, butters, and all of our fried foods, but also in our meats, different snack foods. And again, here we're getting, though, much more energy. So I'm not concerned that you know these two numbers, but you should understand that fats essentially pack more energy per gram than what carbs do, and that's why there are long-term energy storage. So we can store large amounts of energy for long periods in fats better than we can with carbs. So that carbs are more short-term, fats are more long-term. But we also need those fats for those cell membranes or plasma membranes to insulate our nervous tissue, and then like carbs to give us energy. Then we look at our proteins. Again, most of these we get from various foods. So whether it's from animals themselves, but also fish and different grains can have various proteins in them as well, especially beans and that type of thing. And then they're similar to the carbs. They have about 4 calories. Again, I'm not concerned that you know the exact number, but relative amounts compared to each other. Again, we use them for energy, but also a lot of building materials. They help make up our cells as well, but we need them for various enzymes that help our body do what it needs to do. Hemoglobin to transport our oxygen, different hormones that we'll talk about in the endocrine system. They're peptide hormones, which means they're proteins. But we also need them for muscle, that actin and myosin we talked about with our muscles, and then in our bones. So we need proteins for a variety of reasons. If we look at our BMI, or our body mass index, this is a way, kind of a standard measure that looks at the appropriate body weight. So to give us all an idea of where we should be based on our height, where our weight is, and that's referred to as the BMI. So we'll see different charts or a chart similar to this that indicates overweight, kind of more here in the upper right, versus underweight, that is more down in the bottom left, and then kind of the ideal in between there somewhere. So again, you can kind of get an idea here looking at your height and your weight to determine where you would fall as far as your BMI. So by a standard, about 66% of Americans are overweight, and that is determined as being more than 25, having a BMI of greater than 25 or more. So that's what you see here on the table. So 25, while that number kind of changes as far as what the weight is based on your height, again, 25 is that limit. So once you go above a 25 BMI, you would be considered overweight at that point. Right, whenever we talk about food, while it's not part of my plate, fiber is another important or essential part of food. It is mainly parts of food or plant food, cellulose, that makes up the plant cell wall. Remember, plants have a cell wall, animals don't. So we actually can't break down that cell wall because it's something totally foreign to us. So we can't break that down. So all of that moves through. So like lettuce, we don't get a lot of calories from lettuce because it's mainly cellulose and it just goes right through the body. So while we're not getting energy from that, though, it's very important to our diet because diets that are low in fiber decrease the passage of food through the colon, and that can actually increase one's risk of getting colon cancer. So it is good to consume a large amounts of fiber to provide that bulk and allow passage through the digestive system. All right, so if we look at some of these essential substances, so as we look as things have changed, animals have kind of lost their ability to manufacture certain things that we need. So for example, many vertebrates can't make a lot of the amino acids that we need. Bacteria like E. coli is pretty amazing because if you give it glucose, a little bit of sugar, it can make about every amino acid that it needs. However, as animals have continued to change, we see that because that food is naturally available, our body is less dependent on us making it. So we are less able to make different amino acids than organisms earlier in development. So humans, though, again, are unable to synthesize about 8 amino acids, so we have to obtain them from food. And so those are referred to as essential amino acids, meaning we have to consume them in our food because we don't have the ability to make those. Then trace elements and vitamins. So some minerals, again, we only need small amounts of them. So they're referred to as trace elements. We need them, but we don't need large amounts of them. So things like calcium and phosphorus. And then we also need some organic substances. They can also be trace amounts just because we don't need a lot of them. But these vitamins are very important because they can be helpers for some of those enzymes that speed up our reactions. All right, so we have a few different types of digestive systems, mainly based on the foods that on that food source. So these are terms you've heard before. Herbivores, of course, are those who eat plants exclusively. Carnivores exclusively eat meat. And then omnivores, which is where we fall, can eat both plants and animals. So from single-celled protists and other organisms like sponges, they are actually going to digest their food intracellular, so inside. And then all other animals digest food extracellular within the digestive cavity. Okay, so for example, most of our digestion happens in the stomach. Okay, so cells aren't actively involved with that. There's acid and there are enzymes secreted into that space, but the food is digested outside of the cell, and then we absorb the smaller particles from it. A lot of other organisms, especially single-celled, because they don't have a cavity, all that digestion happens inside of the cell. So if we look at this gastrovascular cavity, this is in the cnidarians, in the flatworms like planaria. So this is just a single opening that is both the mouth and the anus, no specialization in digestion, so no stomach, small intestine, that type of thing. So again, just this two-way digestive tract in this case. So again, food comes in and waste goes out of the same opening. Then the alimentary canal, this is where we have separate mouth and anus, so we're going to have two different openings, one for intake and one for outtake, essentially. So there's specialization that occurs here where the food is moving in one direction. So there's chemical digestion that involves the hydrolysis or breakdown that breaks larger food molecules into smaller ones. And then those smaller particles are absorbed into the blood and transported throughout the body. So our one-way digestive tract, so again, we have an intake here at the mouth, and then food must go in one direction to reach a second opening in the anus. All right, so we look at vertebrates. we have the gastrointestinal tract, as well as different accessory organs that help. So in general, carnivores have a shorter intestine compared to herbivores, because again, herbivores have a lot of that cellulose that they can't break down, so the longer intestine allows longer time to digest as much as possible, whereas carnivores, they can break all that protein down, so they don't need as long. Herbivores also have a long, kind of convoluted small intestines, again, larger amounts of cellulose there. And then that tubular gastrointestinal tract has a layered structure. All right, and as we move into the different organs that make up our digestive system, again, organ system has lots of organs that work together for one function, in this case, digestion. So again, we'll be moving through the different parts here, but sometimes it's just nice to visualize it before we talk about it. So as we just mentioned just a little bit ago, again, in vertebrates, we see this kind of layered gastrointestinal tract where we have the mucosa layer all the way inside that's secreting that mucus, then the submucosa, which is just below that, and then the serosa all the way on the outside. And then the muscularis is actually in between those two, and that's where that kind of muscle would be that allows that contraction to occur. So again, this layered system is what we see in vertebrates. All right, so starting at the mouth and the teeth. So many vertebrates have teeth for chewing, are called mastication. Birds, though, which don't have teeth, they break up their food in their two-chambered stomachs. So the first chamber produces those digestive enzymes, kind of similar to our mouth, which are passed along with the food to the second chamber, which is referred to as their gizzard. And then the gizzard actually has small pebbles in it that the bird ingests, and that's just going to help them churn the food or kind of mix the food by some muscular action. And that churning actually grinds up seeds that they eat and other plant materials into smaller chunks that are more easily digested. So they don't have teeth, so essentially in some ways they're kind of replaced by the pebbles that are there in the gizzard. So again, just kind of looking here, so they don't really necessarily, I mean, they have a mouth, but they don't have teeth, so really no digestion is happening in the mouth. So it goes from the esophagus there into that first intestine called the proventriculus, and then into the gizzard where those pebbles would be found for that churning, then on through the intestines and into the anus. Heterodont teeth are what animals have, so they just have different kind of specialized teeth. So all of our teeth don't look exactly the same. So that general pattern is modified depending on their diet. So carnivorous animals versus herbivores would have different types of teeth. So again, the example here of a heterodont, again, just meaning different types of teeth, are canines, especially for those carnivorous that can kind of tear at the meat, then the premolars, and then the molars that are here more for grinding. So again, whether we're looking at a carnivore or herbivore, those teeth are going to look different. Of course, we are omnivores, so our teeth are, again, kind of specialized so that we can have both plants and eat both plants and animals. So we have those front teeth in the back that are similar to carnivores, where we can tear apart the meat, but then we also have those teeth in the back, more the molars that help us with the grinding to break down the plant food. And then, of course, we have baby teeth and then adult teeth. So children only have 20, and then by the time of adulthood, those are replaced by 32. And of course, the main reason for that is because we have that incremental growth. It's not really possible to get 32 teeth as a baby or as a toddler. As we kind of move through that, if all 32 came in at one time, the mouth really wouldn't quite be ready for all of that. So it gives some time for the mouth to grow. So processing food there, of course, the saliva is in there. And the saliva has an enzyme called amylase, and that amylase is especially helpful in breaking down starch. Then the swallowing action, so the food then, of course, moves back to the tongue to be swallowed. The epiglottis is very important here. It's going to prevent the food from going to the respiratory tract, so it closes off that respiratory tract so the food doesn't go to the lungs. I'm just kind of looking here at the pharynx or the throat, the palate, and then into the larynx. Again, we can see this epiglottis here, kind of this nice little flap that covers up. It'll close here to cover up the larynx and into the trachea so that the food doesn't go down there, but instead moves down to the esophagus. Right, so as we move into the esophagus, just this muscular tube that essentially connects us to the stomach. It's just going to be essentially moving in rhythmic waves to where it gets the food down toward the stomach. And then just a picture here to show again the food here as it passes. Again, we block it off from going to the trachea, keep it in the esophagus. As it moves down through there, again, those muscles have that rhythmic contraction that will allow the food to be propelled in one direction down the esophagus and into the stomach. From there, the movement, and once it gets into the stomach, then we have a sphincter there that's going to close to prevent it then from coming back into the esophagus. So it keeps it moving in that one direction. So the contraction of the sphincter, again, prevents the food from going back. However, sometimes, especially during vomiting, then that sphincter is not contracted and food intentionally is brought back up to go back out the mouth. And then also individuals who suffer from acid reflux and heartburn, this is due to that sphincter relaxing too much and some of that food escaping, especially the acid that's in the stomach getting into the esophagus. So once in the stomach, kind of this just sac-like part of the digestive system, it has extra layers of smooth muscle. They just kind of contract and secrete fluids. That fluid are referred to as they have the gastric glands that secrete gastric juices into the stomach, and that's going to include hydrochloric acid that gets released from parietal cells, and then enzymes called pepsinogen that are going to help in the digestion of proteins, and those are released by chief cells. And just kind of looking here at the, so we have the submucosa here, and then the mucosa, again, that layering of the gastrointestinal tract. So again, we're secreting those fluids. So we see some of the chief cells that would be releasing that pepsinogen, the parietal cells that are releasing that hydrochloric acid, and then the gastric glands that would be there that are stimulating and releasing hormones to control all of that. So some of those gastric juices, they're mainly used to keep the pH very low. So it's, again, very acidic. That's why that sphincter relaxes, that acid comes up into the esophagus and leads to that acid reflux and heartburn. So again, much more acidic, but it helps to denature or break down the proteins. Also, it activates an enzyme called pepsin, and it also helps our immune system because it kills a lot of bacteria that can't survive in those acidic conditions. So that pepsin, again, is going to hydrolyze or break down food, especially the proteins, into smaller proteins, and then eventually they can enter into the small intestine, which will further be broken down. And then just another term here, chyme is the name for the mixture of partially digested food and the gastric juice. Right, just taking a little aside here to talk about a gastric ulcer. So overproduction of gastric acid can occasionally eat a hole in the stomach that leads to a gastric ulcer. So especially people who drink a lot of coffee because it's very acidic and they're already releasing gastric acid. So it's further decreasing that pH just kind of eats through it. However, this is also increased by an infection. So there is a bacteria called Helicobacter pylori that also increases the incidence of ulcers. Now we move into the small intestine. So this is kind of the true digestive vat of the body. So here, this is where relatively small portions of that chyme, so that food mixed with the gastric acid, are introduced kind of one at a time. It allows time for that acid to be neutralized and for the enzymes to work on it to break it down. So again, with the herbivores, this needs to be longer because it takes the enzymes longer to break down those that cellulose that we're not used to. So then in the small intestine, again, that energy source, so those carbs, proteins, and lipids are broken down, and this is where they get absorbed into the bloodstream. Now the parts of the small intestine, so we have the jejunum, which is where digestion actually continues, and the ileum, water and digested products get absorbed in this area, and then the lining there is folded into these ridges called villi, and then those are further kind of covered in a field of projections, like little things that stick out, and those are referred to as microvilli. Kind of looks like little hairs on the outside of the cells. All right, so then moving into the pancreas actually secretes and releases a lot of the enzymes needed for digestion. So some are released by the intestine, but a lot of them come from the pancreas. And so therefore it's called an exocrine gland, just because it secretes through ducts. So it leads kind of through canals referred to as ducts. And the pancreas sends those via ductin and empties into the duodenum, which is the part of the small intestine where those enzymes would dump into. And now the digestion of fats requires bile, so that the bile salts are secreted. They also enter into the duodenum, but those, instead of coming from the pancreas, they come from the liver. So that bile salt kind of acts like a detergent, combines with the fat droplets to form these microscopic droplets. This is called emulsification. It increases the surface area and just allows the enzyme lipase to kind of cover it a little better to break it down. So again, just kind of looking here at the small intestine, so seeing the villi here, these little folds, and then the microvilli that are sticking off or sticking out from them that are shown here. Again, that's just going to help with the secretion, also the absorption there that is seen. Okay, now we're ready to move into the large intestine. So it's called large because it's wider in diameter. So there's actually no digestion that's happening here. So everything has happened at that point in the small intestine. So only about 6 or 7% of the fluid absorption occurs here. So again, not a lot of digestion or absorption happening here. So why do we need it? Well, its job is to compact the undigested material to produce the feces. So this is where having that fiber is really important to help with that packing process. All right, so a few variations of the digestive system. So most animals lack enzymes, again, to break down that cellulose. That's why it's called fiber, because it just goes through. But the digestive tract of some actually have different bacteria or prokaryotes or even protists that live inside of them, and they are able to break down the cellulose. So they're able to actually gain a lot of energy from those cellulose materials, not because they can break it down, but because of the organisms inside their digestive tract. And then we also have the ruminants that have these large divided stomachs. So one section called the rumen, that's where those prokaryotic cells and the protists would hang out. So cows and deer, for example, so that little community lives there. So the cellulose is taken there, the bacteria or the protists break it down, release glucose, and then that glucose can be absorbed by the organism. So typically these have 4 chambers. So again, from the esophagus, we go into this rumen. So the first part, that's where the bacteria or the protist would be to break down the cellulose to release the glucose. And then they would continue through the digestive system and then finally into the small intestine. So again, instead of just having one part to the stomach, they have 4 different parts to separate some of the digestion. So again, digesting the cellulose. So other herbivores, besides the ruminants like rodents or horses, again, they also have microorganisms there, but they're in the cecum. So instead of having the ruminant or the rumen, they have an area called the cecum. It's below the stomach because, again, the stomach, the acidity would kill those organisms. So just below the stomach, that is where that would be. And so these are not going to regurgitate because, again, it's below the stomach, so it can't come back up like those ruminants do. So they're below. And they actually, though, that's one of the reasons that these organisms actually eat their feces, is because that's their kind of way of regurgitating their food. Because anything undigested would go out through their feces, so re-eating it would allow it to be broken down again. Gross, yes. All right, so then kind of wrapping up here, looking at some of the other accessory organs to the digestive system. So again, I already kind of mentioned the pancreas, but it secretes the fluid into the pancreatic duct that empties into the duodenum. The small intestine, again, just lots of enzymes coming from the pancreas. So trypsin and chymotrypsin to digest those proteins. Amylase, different than the one in the mouth, but same purpose. It's breaking down the starches or the carbs, and then lipase to break down our fats. And then it also secretes bicarbonate, which neutralizes the hydrochloric acid from the stomach to bring the pH back to neutral. Then the islets of Langerhans. So this is one of those, again, functions of the pancreas. So not only does it release enzymes out of the gland, exocrine, but it also releases enzymes inside. And so some of the hormones that it makes are made by this islets of Langerhans. And this is especially insulin and glucagon that help in dealing with our blood sugar. So individuals who are diabetic, type 1 diabetes, which is the autoimmune, there's an immune attack on those cells, so they don't produce insulin, so they're dependent on insulin. Type 2, which is more associated with obesity. This is where they're just more insulin resistant, or they still may make it, but they don't quite make enough. But again, this is where those cells are kind of being at fault. They're not producing enough or any of those hormones. All right, then just a little bit more about the liver. Again, it's actually the largest internal organ in the body. It makes that bile, and then it stores it in the gallbladder where it gets concentrated. And again, the bile helps especially with the breakdown of the fat, but it can become blocked and gallstones form there. So the arrival of that fatty food to the duodenum triggers the neural response that stimulates the gallbladder to contract and then release that bile. So especially gallbladder issues are seen more with high fat diets because essentially it's just overstimulating the gallbladder and causing problems. All right, so again, our gallbladder here. So the liver makes the bile. The gallbladder is just kind of storing it and concentrating it there so that it can then be released. All right, so the functions of the liver. So the liver is going to do quite a few things. So it removes toxins, pesticides, carcinogens, other poisons, excessive amino acids that are present in the blood can be converted to glucose. So that amino group comes off and they go into glucose. And then that amino group can combine with carbon dioxide to make urea. And then that goes to the liver. So again, our liver does quite a few things, kind of the trash can where we're breaking down things, and a lot of metabolism is happening there. So again, just a little summary table here about all the organs that make up the digestive system and their function. So again, just a nice little study tool. You can kind of cover up each one, or you can make a note card that's similar to this that talks about the function of each of these and what they're doing for the digestive system.